Hi, my friends. So I have a book review for you today, which is unlike me, but I wanted to share it. Actually, I have a couple things I wanted to talk about in relation to this book review. Let me push these out of the way for a moment. So there are two new books available out in the world related to reading Marseille or Pip decks. The one that I got most recently is this one, and this is Seeing the World, Tarot Signposts, The Paths to Perception. And this was written by the late Jean-Claude Flournoy, who is mostly known for recreating a lot of Marseille-style decks. One of my personal favorites is his, and I didn't bring it out. Oh, it's right here. So this is the Jean Noblet. He also did the Dodal, I think, and there's a couple others. Anyway, I am a big fan of this particular deck, and so when I saw that there had been an English translation of his book, I was excited about it. Having said that, I can't yet recommend it, in part because I found it so far really difficult to read, and exhibiting of some of my pet peeves, which is sort of stating as fact things that have not been verified. But I'm going to try to give that a go. But so at the moment, I really can't recommend this yet, and I don't know if I will get to that. But in happier news, I just got this, and it is a very easy read, and in fact I read it in an afternoon. Now, full disclosure, I didn't read every word of it. There's some sections on tarot history, etc., that I did not read because I know those stories. But by and large, I read most of the book, and it's a really good one. So this is Untold Tarot, The Lost Art of Reading Ancient Tarots by Caitlin Matthews. Caitlin Matthews I'm a fan of because though I struggle with Lenormand and have not, made peace with it, this is my very well-worn copy of her book, which I think, of the ones I've looked at, is the best. I have a couple, and I've read it a few times, and, I would say whatever successes I've had, I would say partly come from this book. So I was excited when I found out that she was releasing a book on reading ancient tarots or reading Marseille-style decks. I'm always interested in books on that topic because it's very near and dear to my heart. If you watch my channel, you'll know why. Now, this I found at Barnes & Noble. It's not scheduled to be... I had this on pre-order, actually, because I was super excited about it. And my pre-order was not scheduled to be delivered until October, early October. The book on Amazon is not out yet, but I found this at Barnes & Noble today, and a couple other people on For Love of Cards mentioned that they'd managed to find it at stores in the UK already. So I don't know what the story is, if it's out, if it's not out, but if you find it and you're interested in it, I would grab it, because I don't know what the story is with pre-orders. So I have sort of an array of things in front of me that I wanted to sort of just chat about in relationship to this book. So I guess where to start? Let me say one of the reasons why I have two other books out is sort of I wanted to talk about that in this book in comparison to two that I'm very familiar with. One of them is Yoav Ben-Dov's Tarot the Open Reading. This was I think the first book I read on Marseille specifically, because there aren't a lot of books on this. And Yoav Ben-Dov was a doctor who devoted a lot of time to both writing this book and recreating an edition of the Convert tarot deck, which he self-published, but this is newly available by US Games. This may be familiar to everyone. Of the Marseille books I've read, and there are a handful, there are more than you'd think, this is one of my favorites. Another one that I didn't bring down off the shelf because it's literally under a stack of other things is the J.M. David book on Marseille, which I would like to revisit. But these two, this and that book that I didn't bring down, and I don't have the real version. I bought an ebook edition and printed it because instant gratification was at play. There are others. I do like Camellia Elias's book, her first one. I haven't read the two newer ones. What others are there? Enriquez's book is interesting. It's a little inscrutable for my tastes. I do not. Anyone who watches this. I do not like the Jodorowsky book at all. I did read it, or most of it, and really did not like it for many reasons. And the more I learn about Jodorowsky, kind of the less I am predisposed to like it. But this was the first, and I think this is really good. Now, this, I think, is still available in this edition. This is a self-published version. But there's also a new version called The Marseille Tower Revealed. It's the same book, published by Llewellyn, and it's in color. And that's really the only difference, is that it's a mass-market edition and that the pictures are in color. Which I would actually recommend, if you don't have his deck, getting the color version. If you have his deck, it doesn't matter. I see this on Amazon, so I'm pretty sure. And the reason why is that he talks about color. Now, I'm a fan of this book. It's a little more esoteric than I personally like. But that's, again, I'm very different in that way from a lot of readers. So this was sort of my foundation. It's where my research started in terms of Marseille specifically. And I'm a big fan of it. The other book I brought out, of course, is mine. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit too, and just talk about, to give some context for what I'm going to say about Caitlin Matthews' book. Now, my book is very, very different from, this is actually the proof, it's not the actual published version. I don't think I have a copy of the published version, because I gave them all away at the Reader Studio. Anyway, so my book, I'm just going to plug it here, it's very different from anything else that I'm going to talk about, because what I aimed to do is create a workbook, and that's really what it is. And it's not specifically about Marseille, it's an approach to reading with pip decks, which over time, and both an approach to reading with pip decks and also sort of a case for using them. It's illustrated with my adored Marshmallow Marseille. And in this book, what I do is I take you through sort of it's in a way sort of my own journey, and to how I learned to do that, or things I wished I had done. So what I do in my book is I take you through some methods for reading with the pips. I take you through numerology. I don't necessarily tell you what the numbers mean. I tell you what I've come up with, but what I recommend throughout the book is that you do research and you find your information. So in this case, you begin by doing a lot of research around numerology and coming up with a list of meanings for yourself. We go into working with light and shadow in terms of its meanings. I give some examples. I do a lot of sample readings. There are charts for you to fill out, etc. I include some essays that I've written as interludes that you can read while you're doing the lessons. But I think you could read my book as a book, and if you like my channel, you'll probably like my book, because the sense of humor that I bring to my readings, the dialogue, I purposely tried to make it like I was in conversation with you. So it's not scholarly, it's not super formal, I swear a little bit in the book. I talk a lot about my own mistakes, but the idea behind it was that this is sort of like, I wanted to teach a class, but my life isn't conducive to teaching a class right now. So if I were going to teach a class, this is how I would have done it. These are the exercises I would have put through. Some of these things are things that I did as when I was learning. Some of the things are things I wished I had done as I was learning. But actually, more than half the book is really dedicated to working with the pips, ish, and then we get really just a chapter on the trumps on the majors, because there's so much out there, but I do sample readings. I do little, skits, so to speak, and I tried to be very thoughtful about not only giving you activities to do, but also demonstrating how I would have done them and how I got where I did using the information that I shared with you about how I learned and my own meanings, right? So this is very different. It's not, there's no tarot history on this, in this. It does draw from some historical tarot or cartomantic techniques that I've learned from various people, and I've tried to cite those sources throughout. What else? There was something else I was going to say about this. I guess it also is sort of rooted in my own interest in making really grounded, earthy, practical readings, right? So there's no esotericism in this book. I do not talk about Kabbalah. I do not talk about astrology. I do not talk about I mentioned the Golden Dawn in the context of how tarot got where it is, but you know, my chapter on tarot history is probably about 3 paragraphs. Like this is it. It's designed for people who are new to reading with pips or new to tarot and want to read with this method. There's also a Facebook group that you can join, and if you want to sort of ask questions of other people who've worked through the book or are working through it, or of me, you can join the Facebook group. It's Facebook. It's tarot. It's just the Tarot on Earth study group. You have to have the book in order to join the group. But so anyway, this is my book, I'm obviously very proud of it. It's a very specific thing, and it's a workshop, in essence. And so again, the thing that I really recommend is that if you're looking for a class, this is kind of a way to go. I think that you could have fun reading the book, but I don't think you get everything out of the book unless you do the exercises in it. So some people don't like that. Some people don't like workbooks. So I just wanted to give these in context as preparation for this, because this is a book that's well known. This is my book, and so it, in essence, depicts my way of reading, or at least at the time that I published it. I keep evolving, and I talk about that in the book. This is available on Amazon and Book Depository, by the way. I used to sell it in my Etsy shop, but it's just a pain in the neck. And it's cheaper for you to buy it through those sites anyway, because if you're a Prime member, you have free shipping, and if you are on Book Depository, you get free shipping. So anyway, just plugging my own work. Now, this book is different from both of these. It's not a workbook, and it's not esoteric. So Yoav Ben-Dov's book, though it is not Golden Dawn influenced, does get into a certain amount of esotericism, which he writes about really beautifully. To my taste, it's just not how I read. And Caitlin Matthews is a cartomancer. She is obviously an expert on tarot, but and she talks about it in her Lenormand book, she actually grew somewhat dissatisfied with tarot as it's come to be read, and that's how she found Lenormand, and she has investigated a lot of different cartomantic techniques, things like Kippur, reading playing cards, etc. Now, I am not a Lenormand reader. I have tried many times. I return to it every once in a while. I can read Sibylla. I really love reading Sibylla. I haven't investigated Kippur too much. I do have Tony Poole's awesome book, but I haven't dug in and done that work. I've tried a lot with Lenormand. It's taught me a lot about tarot, actually. I've taken a lot of tarot techniques that I use from Lenormand and from cartomancy. So what Caitlin Matthews is doing in this book is actually approaching it from a cartomantic technique. So she strips away, and this is something that the reason that I brought out my book is because I mentioned there's no Golden Dawn in here, really. That's important to me as a reader now, because I'm not really super interested in that piece of it. I've been reading for a long time, and up until the last 3 or 4 years, that was how I read. I was heavily influenced by the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which of course is heavily influenced by the Golden Dawn. Lately I've taken a different path, and I've taken a lot of stuff from cartomancy and applied it to tarot. So the reason I was excited about this book is that Caitlin Matthews is a cartomancer, I think primarily, so I was excited to see what her techniques would bring to this through the lens of someone who reads Lenormand, playing cards, and has a pre-Golden Dawn approach to reading. So that's what the book promised, and that's what this book delivers. So the first thing I'll say about this is that if you are interested in this book, I would definitely recommend getting it whenever it comes out, because I think it's really, really good. It's really brief. It's only about 225 pages or so, but it's, you know, it's packed with a lot in that space. So, in the interest of not, you know, practicing hagiography, I'm going to tell you what I liked about it, tell you what I don't like about it, and some things that I think are really, really cool that I am definitely interested in exploring more. One of the things that I'll say about this book that made me really happy is that there are things in this book that I did not know. There are things in this book that she approached from a way that I've never thought about before. And so, as someone who has been reading every Marseille or Pip or cartomantic tarot related book I can get my hands on, you know, this isn't like a humble brag. I know a lot about this stuff because I read a lot about this stuff. I'm very, very interested in these techniques. So it's rare, after reading 10 or so books on cartomancy, on Marseille reading, etc., it's rare that I hear something I hadn't heard before, and there are some things in here I had never thought of, never heard before, and that to me is really exciting. You know, as someone who's, you know, I know a lot of people, if they've been reading for a long time, stop reading books, because you just sort of get the same thing over and over again. You know, there's a lot of great books that are coming out right now that I haven't really explored, because they're another you know, it's another approach to the traditional structure, the Eden Gray format of, here's the card, here's what the image looks like, here's what it means. And I'm at a point right now as a reader where I don't necessarily want to be told what the cards mean. I know what they mean. What I'm looking for, I guess, is techniques and things that I haven't considered. And that's just, you know, that's personal. There are a lot of books that are super popular right now that are, here's what the cards mean. And far be it from me to take that enjoyment away from anyone. But I'm always interested in something different. So, this is different, and again, I think if it turns more people on to reading with these kinds of decks, I'm all for it, because I love reading with pip decks for exactly the reasons that she outlines in this book, which is, and people who are aficionados of traditional Golden Dawn decks they bristle at this. The pictures are sometimes out of line with what you want to say as a reader. Knowing different systems, having pip decks allows a certain amount of flexibility and a certain amount of freedom that I love. I love it. You know, Camellia Elias, in one of her blogs, says that meaning doesn't exist. And I've interpreted that as meaning is malleable. That the meaning of cards depend so much on what other cards are around, the question, the day, the mood, the person you're reading for, etc. That meaning is malleable. And that is a harder case to make when you've got the Rider-Waite-Smith 3 of Swords or 10 of Swords, which actually came up in the chat this morning with Kelly from The Truth and Story. It makes it hard. It makes it harder to bend those meanings the way that I like to. That's not for everybody. You know, not everything is for everybody. People love that, and they should, and that's great. But this makes a good case for why pip decks are exciting to read. It also predates. You know, she doesn't really talk about stuff that are specific to Golden Dawn. So the associations with astrology, the associations with Kabbalah are not part of this book. She talks about them a little bit because she talks about the context of why it's useful to read this way. But it's not in the context of card meanings. So I'm going to zoom in. Now I'm going to try to just sort of show some stuff. This is a really glossy stock, so I'll probably have to manipulate the book a little bit. But there's just 7 chapters. She does an intro. She talks about, this is sort of the part that I didn't read most. What's Tarot for? A Brief History, Gaming or Divining. What was interesting was something new in this section of chapter 1, the Bolognese evidence. She actually makes a case that I have heard made before, but not well documented, that there is early evidence that tarot cards were used for divination. She actually gives documented evidence. Other books that I've read that say that have not, so I haven't believed it, but she has some references that I think are really great. She has a chapter on the trumps, she has a chapter on the pips, she has a chapter of the courts, and then this is sort of the part that I loved the most, was divining skills from an earlier era. So this is where she kind of takes those cartomancy techniques and brings them to life in terms of how to use them in a tarot reading. Then she talks about directionality, which is, interestingly, she points out, and it's probably not something we've ever really noticed, I never noticed it, but in most modern decks, the court cards tend to face the viewer, and in a lot of older decks, they tend to look from side to side. So she talks about using directionality, which is not new. I mean, Yoav Ben-Dov talks about that too, but it's just, it's a really cool thing. She talks about things like mirroring and knighting, and then she goes into some really great spreads. There's a tableau, and I'll talk about a couple of them. The trick about reviewing a book is you don't want to give away so much that someone doesn't want to read it, and you don't want to sort of take away, someone's intellectual property either. So I want to show you some things judiciously, and talk about, without giving away the store. So it's full color, it's beautiful. This is interesting. This is a deck in progress, I think, by Robert M. Place that I'm dying for. So on his website, there's only the trumps. And it's a $200 art deck, but in this book there are pips, so I'm hoping that there's a new full, much cheaper version coming out. So anyway, we get this sort of introductory stuff. She uses a handful of different decks. She uses the Yoav Ben-Dov deck. She uses this is why this box deck is out, the Tarocchi della Fina, or the Tarocchi della Torre in Bologna, because she uses it in this book. So the thing that I like about this book is it's great for a beginner. It's still interesting for someone who's not. It's actually written, I think, to an audience of people who are interested in reading with pips but are grounded in Rider-Waite-Smith and that or similar. And what's nice about that is she eases you into the topic, and she's like, here's how we can transition out. And here's, it's going to be tough, but there are ways to do it. The chapter on the trumps was to me, like, this section here on the trumps was like the least exciting for me, and it feels like, just as a reader, it feels like maybe this was the least exciting for her as an author too. Every trump gets a 2-page spread. You get a picture from a different pip deck, a little quote, translations in different languages, typical keywords, who this person would be in real life, examples of combinations. Now this to me was a struggle, right, because she gives combinations of the cards, but in this section we haven't yet seen her systems, and so the card combinations and the meanings that she derives from those, they don't make a whole lot of sense to the reader of the book until you get later on into the book and she explains her different ways of reading. And then there's a long sort of little essay on the card. It's interesting. There's usually a lot of historical context in the essay, and then like a sentence or two on how it might work in a reading. So this is where we get kind of a more traditional tarot book, like card by card. This is what's happening in the image. Here's some historical context. Here's what it means. Still well written, still interesting. Just not the most exciting part of the book. And she goes through all of the trumps, and you can see the different decks she uses in it. And again, they're not long. It's a quick chapter. Again, I read this book in an afternoon, and it wasn't a tedious afternoon. I was excited to share it with people, but I wouldn't have rushed it because I don't like doing that. So we get that for the trumps, and that's pretty much what she talks about. And then things get more interesting as the book goes on. She has some really nice charts in here. Here's a chart, for example, on the trumps as rites of which trumps are indicative of rites of passage, motion and pace. She talks about how trumps in pairs with each other have special meanings. Like, just for example, trumps in pairs in sequential pairs. So, for example, the Pope and the Lovers, she says, might specifically mean a marriage because of the connection between the trump of the Pope and the Lovers. And then she gets into the pips. And the thing that I really like about this book, she talks about really the origin of the suits, but she gives you several ways that you can go about reading with pips. One way is the method that I use in my book, which is she gives you number meanings. Now her number meanings are similar to mine. As we get into 7, 8, 9, they're very different, which is fine, you know what I mean? And one of the things, again, I'm just going to keep talking about my book because why not? I think that my book was meant to really work in conversation with other books, so that's why I'm sort of bringing it out here. One of the things that you do in my book is read 6 or I think 3 to 6 different iterations or definitions of numerology, and I say, here are some resources you can use. Here are the ones I used, but this is a good list. So she gives you numbers. This is the first thing that I find really interesting. So she goes through the qualities of the suits. So she talks about what the suits do, but then she has this really great chart which I bookmarked that I really love, and I'm just gonna try to zoom even further in so you can get a sense of kind of how this is something I never considered or thought of before, and I won't show the whole thing, but she talks about this sort of really long chart of each suit and different qualities of it, how a primary quality is expressed, its literal mode, how it's affected, how it operates, like, can you see that? Yeah, so swords operate as war, batons as government, cups as peace, deniers as commonwealth. She talks about the parts of the body that they're connected to, actions. I just think it was a really, I've seen similar things in connection to more esoteric readings of the cards, but this is the first sort of really practical list I've seen. And it's a really great list. And then she kind of goes through and does some math for you. Now this is where I actually prefer other methods, because she sort of she does the work for you. It's not my favorite thing, but it's good. So she goes through that. And then there are other methods where she associates the numbers to the trumps and their connection to each other. So ones are associated with any trump that has one or ends in 1. So you get the magician, fortitude, and the world. And she sort of reduces those 3 trumps into a like keywords, and then your numbers are then, so aces would be associated with those keywords, 2s would be associated with keywords she derives from the Pope and the Hanged Man, because they are 2 or end in 2. Really, really cool. I'd never thought of that before, and I think for any reader that can add a lot of shading to it. And then she goes into a more old-fashioned cartomantic sort of playing card approach to the pips, which seems to be, from what I can gather, the method that she uses most. And she goes through each of the numbers by suit. She goes through all of the suits by number. She goes through the courts as well. So she goes really deep into working with the pips, which I think is what most readers who are entering this world really want to know about, because the trumps are the trumps. And she does some interesting spreads based on, in order to practice reading with the pips. She has a Demolay spread. And there's some really great spreads in this. Then she talks about the courts. And why did I bookmark this? Oh, the way she talks about the suits and the courts I think is really fascinating. I bookmarked this so I could come back and revisit it, more closely. And so she talks about combining the courts with the suits. She talks about associating the suits with the virtues. So here's a really cool chart that she put together of this. I think is great for anyone learning the courts, because she gives us sort of a virtue of each court, a deficiency, and then an excess. So we get kind of the home base, how it could be deficient in something and how it could demonstrate excess. So even just in this chart, you get a really beautiful layered picture of who the courts can be. A really fascinating spread she created using the courts as a sort of relational spread for like collaboration. And then chapter 5 is really about all these old-fashioned techniques that are really useful as a tarot reader today. So she goes through reading, this is very Lenormand. If you read with Lenormand, a lot of this will be familiar, reading in lines. Whoops. There's a lot of stuff about reading lines. There's a great spread that she has using mirroring. Here's another spread called The Cross and Passport. There's a lot of good. I think this book is really useful for spreads, especially if you're interested in a more down-to-earth, sort of less more practical, less esoteric reading method. She has a great spread about the pages, which I really like. I sort of don't want to reveal stuff because I don't want it to take away from the experience of reading. She gives examples of most of the spreads. Again, because her reading, she seems to be pulling from different systems and different techniques as she reads. I think I would have liked if she had expanded a little bit more on how she arrived at the meanings. She'll say, like, 6 means this, but because my system is so different, I can't make that association, so I'd love to know, I'd love to have her say, like, in my system, 6 means this because, so I landed on this. I think that would be helpful, especially to a new reader. Yes, I do think that would be helpful. I think there's so much value in here. I think this book could have been a little longer with explanation of how she arrived at the meanings that she did. Especially because one of the key things she talks about in this book is that meaning is malleable. It changes based on the context, which I'm a big believer in. But her system is so different from a lot of what's taught, it seems. And it can feel, as a student, because her system is so both specific and also kind of unrevealed in this book, as a new reader, it can easily sort of feel like, how did she get there? Like earlier I learned that 6 is harmony plus swords, which is intellect. How did 6 in this case become danger? For example, that's just something I made up, you know what I mean? But like I think the student could benefit from more expanded meanings. But here she does a tableau of 25 cards, really fascinating. This is going to be really interesting to anyone who likes Lenormand or Kipper. This is something I absolutely intend on taking and using. She uses all those Lenormand techniques. She sort of offers more spreads in solution, in conclusion, that I really like, and she just sort of coaches you through the process of learning. And at the end, she also lists the cards that she used in the book. So again, it's not a big book. It's pretty thin. It's only about 250 pages, less than that. Beautifully designed, glossy pages, really colorful. Released by Schiffer, which is nice. And I like that they're sort of taking a mantle of education and, designing really gorgeous books. The book is beautifully done. So I really recommend this book a lot to anyone who is interested in reading this way. It's a short book. It is really well written. You don't get more sort of expert than Caitlin Matthews, certainly. And it takes an approach that's really unique to tarot these days, which is one that really resonates with me. So if you like my channel, I think you'll like a lot of what's in this book. I think if you're like Pip curious, that you're going to like this book. She makes a case for why you should add this toolkit to your techniques. And I, in both my videos and my book, have tried really hard to make that case too, so it resonates with me. So I'm a really big fan of this. I think it's a really good book, really easy to read, really fast read, really well researched. It's well researched without being dry and scholarly. She has technique. She's a good writer, and it's well organized. And the things I don't like about it are, nothing's perfect for anyone's standards. The things I don't like about it, other people may very well like about it. But I think that the few things I dislike are far outweighed by the things that I like. And I think my recommendation for books, on this topic, I think this has jumped to the top for anyone who's interested in learning this. Obviously, in conversation with my own labor of love here. And I do think, again, this book was designed to work with other books, you know what I mean? So this isn't like the only tarot book you'll ever need. This is like the workbook that helps you develop some skills. This is a great resource. So, yeah, I've managed to both promote myself and talk about this wonderful book. And I will revisit it. Like I said, I read it in an afternoon. There were parts that I just didn't need to hear about. But I really looked for anything that was new in it. And there's a lot of stuff. There's some really interesting stuff about the Bolognese decks and the systems that exist for Bolognese, reading the Bolognese systems and the cards that exist. Yeah, I think it's great. I really do. And there's a lot of, even just from the point of view of the spreads in this book, I think it's worth its price. So I can't say enough nice things about it. So that's my thoughts on this wonderful new book, along with my typical ramblings on many other things. So get it.